Electrotechnical Commission, and I'm joined by four eminent speakers. On my left here I have Roger Cruz, who is Marketing and Uptake Lead at Fast Infra Label. Then I have Matt Doherty, who's Senior Advisor and Officer of the IEC Global Impact Fund. Next to Matt is Eric Ruiz, who's Deputy Director, Project Facilitation and Support at IRENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency. And last but by no means least, we have Caitlin D'Onofrio, who's Senior Project Manager, Standards, UL Standards and Engagement. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for being here. I just want to perhaps begin by setting a little bit of the context. In order to deliver on the energy transition and to hit climate targets, we clearly need to massively increase financing for alternative energy sources such as wind, solar and the other renewables, and at the same time we need to leave fossil fuels in the ground. This year's COP is being hailed, and has been for some time, as Finance COP, because it's time for countries to set a new goal for finance climate action. For banks, that means stopping further financing of fossil fuel extraction, but it also needs the sustainable development community to provide clear paths to finance. And we've talked quite a lot about how the efforts in the sustainable community need to match the efforts in the finance sector. So I'm sure we'll touch on some of those points in a minute. If we perhaps have a look at some of the numbers, I think the gap that exists in investment between fossil fuel investment and sustainable investment is quite stark. Back in 2022, governments globally issued more than 1.7 trillion in public money to support fossil fuels. That contrasts with an investment of around about 486 billion in the same year, but we must effectively reach nearer to 10 trillion by 2030. The gap is closing, and perhaps I can quote here Simon Steele, who is the UN Climate Change Executive Secretary, who earlier on this week at a press conference said, "The IEA predicts 2 trillion will be invested in clean energy and infrastructure this year alone." And that's remarkable, but it's only a fraction of the global economy, and the vast majority of it concentrates on a few big markets. Climate investment must flow to where it's needed most to save and improve lives and livelihoods of billions of people all around the world. So, I guess the question still remains then, what can we do to close that investment gap still further? And perhaps if I ask that question to all of you, and you can perhaps tell us how your organizations are helping to close that investment gap. So maybe, Roger, start with you.
Yeah, well, thank you, James. Thank you, IC. Thank you, Standards Pavilion, to bring this relevant discussion. Thanks for my colleagues here. Yeah, the question is how to connect investors to good projects. And I guess there is one bad news, which is there is no single answer. There is no silver bullet. The good news is that we have different solutions in the market that are able to deliver, deliver a solution to this challenge. And from our perspective, we're talking about standardization of sustainability and resilience requirements for infrastructure. But for sure, my colleagues are going to bring another solutions that together we can create more connection between projects and investors. And I'm going to talk about sustainable infrastructure in a general way, but renewables is a big portion of it, perhaps the most urgent sector that we have here around this. So when I'm speaking about sustainable infrastructure, I'm speaking about renewables as well. So as I was mentioning, Fast Infra Label is trying to deliver one part of the solution, which is the standardization of sustainability and resilience performance measurement of infrastructure assets. So, and why is this relevant? And to tell you why it's relevant, perhaps I have to go to the history behind Fast Infra Label. So we are a coalition of some of the biggest infrastructure investors in the world with one common problem. They want to see more projects, they want to invest more, but also with common problems. And then I'm going to highlight 3 common problems here. The first one is the availability of quality projects. And when I mean quality projects, there are several aspects of it, so I'm going to focus on the sustainability performance of it. There is no intrinsic sustainable infrastructure project. There is not something like, oh yes, we are a solar farm, we are a wind farm, and because we're decarbonizing, we are sustainable. No, there are many other aspects that you should take care of to make sure you're doing no harm, you're not bringing any risk to the investor. So there are biodiversity things, there are resilient aspects, social impact aspects, there are governance aspects that infrastructure assets should take care of in order to improve their risk profile and be more attractive to investors. So, I mean, the availability of quality projects is one of the causes is actually the lack of standards, a lack of measurement systems of what is sustainable infrastructure. And the consequence of it is also the lack of ability of investors to really assess the claims of sustainability and resilience of infrastructure projects, because the measurement, the standard is lacking, right? So to make it a little bit more clear to you, it's the solution that those investors came is, okay, let's have one standard, one labeling system that is going to be the standard for the private sector to invest in sustainable infrastructure when it comes to analyze the sustainability and resilience aspects of an asset. So that's where Fast Infra Label came, and this is why we are here. And Fast Infra Label is a labeling system, it's not a certification. So it came with different aspects of it as well. But mainly what we are trying to achieve here is 3 points. First thing is by being the private sector standard, to establish a common ground between what is sustainable and resilient infrastructure. And what does it mean? We have different voices in the market. We have different relevant standards, relevant guidelines. And so Fast Infra Label is not trying to be one more. The market doesn't need one more standard, one more label. The market needs integration between what is good, what is relevant to the measurement system. So Fast Infra Label is built on more than 50 different guidelines, standards, taxonomies. And with that, we are bringing what is the best in the market, and hopefully being the common voice between investors, public sector, and developers. And why this is important? Because you should build higher confidence here. So it should create, and we are doing it, a credible, independent verification system. So with that, with that in place, we will be able to facilitate transactions in a sense of facilitating screening, facilitating, a portion of the due diligences, making sure that the investors are going to have their lives a little bit easier, and going to have more access to the projects. I think Eric can tell a little bit more about it. Last but not least, to create a strong data set. So, and that's where the label is special. So it's not only a labeling system, but we are being, Fast Infra Label is embedded in Bloomberg data technology. So it means like by having all these infrastructure assets being labeled, we're going to be able to create a real marketplace for sustainable infrastructure projects, renewable energy projects, and with that helping also origination. So that's where when we are, contributing to this connection between investors and projects. So by having Bloomberg with decades of experience in getting data, cleaning data, analyzing data, and delivering data to decision makers, to invest. So yes, last but not least, it's like we believe that these measurement systems in this sense can connect investors, developers, public sector, and create a new generation of projects, being able to create more capacity in the market, and hopefully have more projects and facilitate investment decision making. Thank you.
Really interesting. Thank you, Roger. Matt, maybe if we come to you next, carrying on down the line. I'm very familiar with some of your work, certainly in terms of how you're delivering access to rural communities. But could you tell us a little bit about how you plug this investment gap?
Sure, but maybe I could try, because I think these points are really interesting, and these words we hear over and over again of confidence, of risk mitigation, of credibility. I think the fast infra approach at the level of sustainable infrastructure is what I would say very kind of macro. What we are doing with the IEC Global Impact Fund is at a smaller scale. It's almost a proof of concept. So IEC has been developing these standards for a very long time, as we know, has been doing this standardization work, has been doing the conformity assessment side of it. Until last year, IEC had never used its own standards and had never really seen what it meant at the level of, for example, a rural community in sub-Saharan Africa, before and afterwards of the application of IEC standards. So the fund itself was created, first of all, for IEC to have a concrete reflection of the power of its work, which again had never happened before, but also to create a kind of feedback mechanism to inform IEC, to inform its community of what the standards themselves can do and what happens when they're not present. And that's really what we've started to do since the beginning of 2023, as well as having created this platform that's allowed us to speak and understand the work of Fast Infra and others are doing in this space. Tangibly, the first project that we're doing is as I say, in rural Kenya. We are refurbishing 9 solar installations at 9 sites across critical social institutions, schools and hospitals. We're working with our SME partner on the ground. They have done a series of site visits, and what they've seen is what many of us already knew, and they certainly already knew, is on arrival at many of these places, you have installations funded by different sources, public, private, philanthropic, government, wherever it might be, often donor funded. But done in a very fragmented way. Often with a solar installation, what happens is it can fail anywhere on average between 18 and 48 months, let's say, but it can also be after 1 month, and it can also live its full lifetime of between 8 and 10 years. Mm-hmm. And this is often dependent on the standards that have been respected at the beginning of the project. Within these social institutions, I think the record that the SME has seen is 8 solar installations, one next to the other, funded from different sources, and none of them working. So we're talking about kids at school, we're talking about hospitals without access to electricity, women giving birth by torchlight, kids who can't have their exams printed. So we know from a social impact point of view, this is extremely important. From an international standardization point of view, what we are now doing with the batteries that have been refurbished and now will be installed is putting them into these institutions, electrifying the schools and hospitals, giving the energy, which we could easily argue is a human right, by the way, into these critical social institutions, and then seeing what that means to them, as well as identifying. I've heard Fast Infra referred to as a meta standard, which I really do love this term. What we've been doing is really drilling down into the level of the standards, the conformance to the international standards, really identifying them and saying this is the difference that this standard can have if you don't have it, and this is what will happen if you do have it. And at the moment, we've got over 20 IEC standards, and this really isn't necessarily an IEC endeavor. It could be any international standards broadly, to say this is what happens when you do have them. Then to understand what that would be like if we went beyond the 9 sites. 9 sites is great. Again, this is a very important endeavor, what we're doing, but compared to the scale of the problem, it's frankly a drop in the ocean. IEC doesn't have the capacity nor the resources to be able to understand this properly, and we're not trying to duplicate anything that large infrastructure funders will do, whether they're development banks, development agencies, private sector, whoever it might be. Once we have done that, we can really see the social impact. We can start to extrapolate that data to understand what that would mean at county level, at national level, and even beyond. and then for us to have a dialogue, as we're already doing with Fast Infra, with Arena, with others, as well as development agencies who are funding such projects, to say, actually, there's a better way of doing things. If standardization, if the work that IEC does is embedded into projects from the beginning and is done in a very systematic way, then funding can go further. And those that are funding these projects at the moment, as the custodians of philanthropic or public funding, taxpayers funding, whatever it might be, are starting to listen and really understand that there is a way to work together in a collaborative way, as many of these organizations are very good at doing, as IEC is getting better at doing over time. And to really look at this design, I think you said of looking at the actual, how the projects are designed from the beginning, I think is what were you getting at earlier. And this is really where we need to be going next, once we've seen the initial results of the first project come to fruition.
Thank you, Matt. You've touched quite a lot on the interconnection and the interplay between standards and finance, and we'll perhaps come back to that in a little bit. But Eric, if I can move on to you from an IRENA perspective, how are you closing the investment gap?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really like that it's more of a family talk, like kind of a round table. So yeah, in Arena I work in the Project Facilitation and Support Division, which is the youngest division in the agency. It was created in 2020 under the direction of the current Director General. Arena is a fairly new agency, you could say, let's say young. We started in 2009, so 15 years old. And for the first decade, we did a lot of advocacy, and we were informing the world about renewables, why they were good, why it was good for business, why it was good for the environment, the way to go. And in 2020, we believe that the world is more or less convinced. We know that renewables is the way to go. Now we really need to implement, to start deploying finance on our member countries. Today we have 170 members, including 169 countries plus the European Union. So we are being asked to innovate. And our message to countries is, okay, even though we have to innovate, you still need to master the basics. And the basics is that finance, like electrical current, is going to flow through the path of less resistance. And when you talk with countries, what is the path of less resistance is when you have clear standards, when you have clear regulatory frameworks, clear policies, instead of very complex but flexible ones that really make your risk perception higher. And that is what we need to avoid. We work mainly with the global south when we need to deploy these renewable energies, and we advise the governments on that. We tell them, okay, this is what you need to do to attract this finance and to decrease your risk. And then on the other hand, in 2019, together with UNDP, SE4All, and GCF, we created a platform called the Climate Investment Platform, which is dedicated to receiving projects from public and private sector, advising those developers on how to bring their projects up to a bankable level, and then we engage with financial institutions to understand from them what they are looking for. What are their standards, what are their geographies, what products they are offering, and then we translate all that information to the developers, because they do not have the time or the resources to do that. So we are in the middle, we're the middle person there, bringing these two together. The Climate Investment Platform so far has been a success. We have financed around 5 projects, $86 million in 5 years. It takes time, because usually the projects that come to us are projects that need help. The big players, they go directly to the banks, but we want to focus on those that need help. So in COP26, we launched another initiative, the Energy Transition Accelerator Financing Platform, which is a complementary platform to the CIP. And this one focuses on larger scale projects and projects that are also more advanced, that are ready to receive that finance. So it is an accelerator. So that is the aim of the ETAF. And through the ETAF, we are also partnering with initiatives like Fast Infra that work on the upstream, because we need to move fast. We don't have time. I mean, if we look at the numbers right now, we are super late for 2030 and even later for 2050. So how can we accelerate due diligence, for example? Okay, we need to employ standards, we need to employ initiatives like Fast Infra that can give a label to a project that will give the confidence to an investor and say, your due diligence can be simplified because we already did the work for you upstream. So that is exactly what we need. So we are creating those partnerships and advising governments on how to employ them, as well as advising project developers. And at the same time, our message to financial institutions is the same, is we know you have the financial means, but you're waiting for good projects. We need you to understand that the projects that are coming from this side of the world, they are different. And we need to look at them with a different eye. So we need to strike the balance between what we cannot compromise, and that's where standards and policy comes, to what we need to adapt. Because we cannot employ the same solution everywhere in the world, right? Every country is their own universe. So country approach is also what we are trying to employ here. And striking that balance is our main challenge. And yeah, we're moving ahead with that. We'll see where we get by 2030. Thank you.
Okay. Eric, thank you very much. And Caitlin, would you like to tell us about how UL is helping?
Yeah, as of right now, so I work for the UL standards and engagement side, so coming from more of a standards development perspective is what we've noticed. We have many different types of standards that focus on renewable energy and that standardization part of it. But where we've noticed a big challenge is that collaboration aspect. Is there's a lot of regulatory inconsistencies amongst different regions, countries, and currently the standards that we focus on are very North America specific. So really branching out globally and establishing partnerships with the financial institutes as well, because with a standard to back up the certification of a renewable energy project always helps with insurance and in decreasing that financial investment, or backing up the financial investment, because the insurance companies like to have these type of eco-label associated with the project. So really for us, what we're trying to do to bridge this gap is further our collaboration and further partnering with different types of organizations, because we know from a UL perspective it is very North American type focus, and a lot of these issues are very global. Looking at Africa with a lot of solar farms, we know that there's going to be a resilience issue. There's a lot of solar farms out there that unfortunately aren't working. They're supposed to last 25 years, and within 2 to 3 years they're shutting down. So creating new partnerships with different parts of the standardization world that can look at these different countries and know the regulatory differences, and to help bridge that gap and ensure that these products are resilient, to partner with different eco-label type companies and further that reach just for impact itself is what we're trying to do, especially for my team, is not so much looking at UL Pacific, but it's that impact and partnership and collaboration that we're looking to do further.
Caitlin, thank you very much. So Eric, I'd just like to come back to you actually for a second. You mentioned the need to move fast, and that's one of your challenges. Could you perhaps explain how you think we can mobilize capital effectively to support projects that drive growth in renewables whilst reducing the reliance on fossil fuels? From your perspective, what's a path, what's an avenue to achieve that?
Sure. I'm going to take a bit on what Caitlin said, because I really believe the fact that she was saying we need to adapt to the needs of the countries, right? We need to see also the peculiarities of each country, like they are all different in their own way. So one of the things that we're doing is we are trying to engage with countries that are leading regional initiatives. During the last COP, for example, Kenya, they launched the Accelerated Partnerships for Renewables in Africa that covers 7 countries. It was led by President Ruto, and as IRENA, we are serving as the secretariat for that. So one of the things that we're doing there is that, okay, perhaps as an international organization, we're not leading that, but it is important that the countries in the region lead their own initiatives. So number one, countries in the region need to lead their own initiatives because they understand what is needed for themselves. Coming from Global South, it's very hard to get that idea. So we need to create those kind of partnerships. Then we need to have a country approach. So again, we call it like investment workshops, investment events on specific countries to understand what their project developers need. The other point that we also learned from these 7 African countries is that 2 to 10% of their total project cost goes only on the project development part. So they need investments to develop the project. So you have financial institutions on one side saying, bring me good projects, but then the developers on the other side is like, yes, but I need finance to develop the projects, to bring you good projects. So can we finance that? So it's also explore avenues with the financial institutions and also different as well as partners that they work on the development realm. So focus on that. Then focus on the technologies that are fast and easy to deploy. I mean, and I come from Arena, and that is why we do not advocate nuclear, because it takes a while.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the numbers, it will take a while, and we don't have that time. So let's focus on solar, let's focus on wind. And when you look also at the figures of the cost, on Monday, Arena, we launched our World Energy Transition Outlook for 2024. And in there, we were discovering that 81% of the total investment in renewables that happened last year was cheaper than the fossil fuel alternative. So cost is not anymore an excuse. So focus on those technologies that are cheaper, that are faster to deploy, local solutions being led by local governments and local initiatives.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Roger, now if I can dig into a little bit of what you were saying, you play this really important connecting role between development community and investors. Could you tell us a little bit about what makes a project bankable, and how do we connect the right investors to the right projects? It seems as though you're in a prime position to be able to facilitate that.
Oh, I'd say prime, but I can help a little bit on that. But I want to build on something that Eric is telling about the project preparation. And there is one data that's really interesting. It's like 80% of the projects, they die before they get access to finance.
Mm-hmm.
There is this valley of death of projects that have been developed somehow, pre-feasibility, and they fail to get access to finance. What is bankable? So let me go through another way. A portion of those projects are failing because they are like not a good business. They're not feasible. No, in the region, there's no connection, or it's not a good business case. Risk, lack of policies, lack of conditions to invest in that specific region. But a portion of other projects are really mainly to the lack of understanding on what investors need, not only in sustainability issues, but also in financial issues, which comes to, together like a bankable project. So I'm not saying that all the project developers are lacking this knowledge, because there are great developers, great organizations that are capable to be like in an investment committee, to present their projects. At some point, they will get access to finance, but there is this 80% of the projects that are failing because they don't know the requirements. So what is bankable? It really depends on the level of the organization, or what the investor wants. But what the organization really wants is like a low-risk project, to stable cash flows, no risk of construction, no risk of operations, so those things. But it's really a broad concept. What it means, like stable cash flows in the future, what it means to be sustainable, what it means to have no risk of construction. So there are lots of different aspects on it, and I think it's I was not saying fast. I think it's like the market responsibility to build capacity in the markets that this is needed the most. So yeah, sometimes there are a few places in the globe that it's quite difficult to invest, but where we have those champions, we have like transformative policies being in place. There is our need to go there, make sure that we can level up the projects, and making sure that this 80% is going to be way less, and we have good bankable projects to invest in.
Excellent, thank you. So that's a clear picture of what makes a project valid and attractive. Caitlin, now maybe if I come back to you from your standards development perspective, what sort of projects do you see that require investment in order to integrate renewable energy into people's lives? And also maybe if you could touch on how the grants landscape, which is of course an aspect of financing, is changing and being adapted over time?
Yes, so we do have one specific standard that looks at the renewable low impact electricity bundled. It could be bundled or looking at the renewable energy credits. So again, it is very North American Pacific, where my team is looking currently to determine if we want to readapt the standard to make it more global or do partnerships. But that's where a lot of like the bigger organizations do come to us and look to comply with this type of standard, get the certification, and have these renewable energy credits. These renewable energy credits can be transferred. They could use them as the organization. There could be a middle broker that sells these renewable energy credits, and there could also be a consumer that uses these credits. It's very different than offsets, much as the offsets of greenhouse gases, where these credits are directly in a form of megawatt per hour that doesn't even go to greenhouse gases. So in North America, it's used a little differently, but a lot of these renewable energy credits are big backing of the financial capacity of creating these wind, solar, biogas, hydro type renewable energy projects. But again, these are bigger investments. We're trying to bridge the gap of the smaller guys.
Yeah.
There's a lot of projects that unfortunately don't get the financial investment. So instead of concentrating on the bigger organizations, is how can we, as a standards development organization, ensure that we bridge the gap through partnerships or just ensuring that we have bigger impact and not looking at the top 20% of the market that can get the financial backing. How can we create something that allows for the rest of the 80% to ensure that these smaller type of organizations, because coming to UL, using UL certification bodies is quite expensive, but a lot of financial backings want those certifications. So how can we bridge that, ensure that the price to comply, to use our type of standards will help the smaller organizations. So we are looking at measuring impact and not so much bottom line.
Excellent, thank you very much. And then finally, Matt, if we come back to you, you've talked a little bit about the interconnection between standards and finance, but could you tell us a little bit more about the role that standards play in making projects attractive and financeable, and what could we do to increase the role that standards play there, and how can we give standards a bigger presence in the decision-making process for investors?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is also what Eric said about projects being to a large extent locally driven. What we're doing by working directly with the Kenyan National Committee is not turning up from Geneva and explaining how to reinstall a solar installation, right? And that's, we are able to bring that global expertise, the pool of expertise that IEC has, which is very well established and trustworthy. But having a national committee based in Nairobi who can go to the sites, who can be very hands-on in terms of how they manage the project is extremely important. And again, we're seeing that at a pretty small scale. We've had discussions with IRENA on APRA, the Accelerated Partnership for Renewables in Africa, and I think that's a perfect example of real country leadership. And that's why, first of all, it was established, but that's also why I think that we, in that effect, have a role to play. IRENA isn't a norm-setting organization. It works with IEC, it works with other standard-setting organizations, because that's what IEC's bread and butter is at the end of the day. And that's where I think through demonstration projects that we're doing in the Global Impact Fund, we can show that there's a way to do things locally driven, that can bring the standards to the projects, but that can also be scaled and be relevant to the other things that we're hearing on this panel today. I think one of the missing aspects, and we haven't spoken about that, is the role of credit rating agencies, who, to be slightly provocative and very frank, have very little knowledge of the country context, and I think that is something that is changing. But the role that these agencies play have a massive effect on what is a bankable project. Their local knowledge is increasing, but I think this community and others have a role to play in making sure that that goes in the right direction. And again, this comes back to your point on being adaptable and trying to know exactly where to compromise. The standards community traditionally, I would say, doesn't compromise that much, and it's probably another area that we need to get better at as well.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So I'm hearing some interesting themes coming out of this: the need to move fast, the need to adapt, be locally driven, and of course that all-important collaboration that drives everything which is, of course, an underlying theme and requirement for everything that COP is all about. We're going to conclude our panel discussion at this point. Thank you very much to all my panelists here.
Thank you.
I hope you found that interesting and insightful. We're going to have a little bit of a breakout. We'll ask ourselves, together with the audience, a question or two and see if we can come up with some answers in relation to this topic. So thank you very much for joining the panel discussion.
Thank you. Thank you
very much.
Okay.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.